At 77 years old, Eleanor Vance stood on the gravel driveway of her family estate and watched her stranger hammer a for sale sign into the lawn. But what her son Mark and his wife Sarah didn't know, what their calculations had completely ignored, was that the most valuable thing Eleanor owned wasn't the house they were stealing. The justice coming for them would not be delivered by a judge or a jury, but by a rusted lock and a truth decades in the making. If you have ever felt the sharp edge of a loved one's betrayal, if you have been told you are too old to matter, or if you have stood in the ruins of your own life wondering where to turn, this story is for you. Subscribe now to see the moment Eleanor finally turned the key, because the ending of this story is a miracle you cannot afford to miss. The driveway smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Eleanor gripped the brass key in her pocket. The navy velvet ribbon was frayed against her thumb. She didn't look at the house. She looked at the trunk sitting on the grass. It was heavy and dark. The wood was scarred from years in the attic. Her husband, Richard, had told her to keep it closed. He had told her that 40 years ago. Mark walked toward her. He was wearing a suit that cost more than Eleanor's monthly pension. He didn't look at his mother's face. He looked at his gold watch. "The car will be here in 10 minutes, Mom," he said. He spoke as if he were talking to a slow child. "Sarah has the paperwork for the new place." Eleanor did not move. "The new place is a single room, Mark," she said. Her voice was quiet. "It's a suite, Mom," Sarah said from the porch. Sarah was holding a tablet. She was checking boxes on a digital list. "It has a view of the garden." Eleanor knew the garden was a patch of concrete and a chain-link fence. Eleanor had been a schoolteacher for 40 years. She had spent every summer working extra shifts at the public library. She had sold her mother's original engagement ring to pay for Mark's first business loan. She had cancelled her retirement trip to Italy to cover his legal fees when that business failed. She had never asked for a single dollar back. She had lived on toast and tea for 6 months, so Mark could afford the down payment on his own home. She had worn the same wool winter coat for 12 years. She had graded thousands of papers under a dim lamp to keep the heating bill low. She had given him everything. Now, he was selling the house she had shared with Richard. He had told her the taxes were too high for her to manage. He had told her the stairs were a danger to her health. He had used the power of attorney she signed in a moment of grief after Richard died. The locksmith finished the front door. The sound of the deadbolt clicking shut was loud in the silence. The man handed Mark a new set of keys. Mark didn't offer them to Eleanor. He put them in his pocket. The movers began to lift the heavy oak table. It was the table where Mark had done his homework. It was the table where Eleanor had graded those papers for decades. "We can't take the trunk," Mark said. He pointed at the dark wood box on the grass. "There's no room in the car for old junk." "It goes where I go," Eleanor said. Mark sighed. He looked at Sarah. Sarah rolled her eyes and kept scrolling on her phone. "It's just old papers and dust, Eleanor," Sarah said. "Richard probably wanted it thrown away years ago." Eleanor felt a cold spark in her chest. Richard had never said that. Richard had told her the trunk was her life jacket. He had said it on a rainy Tuesday in 1984. He had been holding her hand. Eleanor looked at her son. She didn't see the boy she had raised with love. She saw a man who saw her as an expense. She saw a man who saw her as a problem to be solved. "I'm not leaving it," Eleanor said. Mark checked his watch again. The black car pulled into the driveway. "Fine," Mark said. He signaled to one of the movers. "Put it in the back of the car." The mover grunted under the weight. Eleanor followed the box. She sat in the back seat of the car. She held her small suitcase on her lap. She had $12.42 in her purse. She had a brass key on a navy ribbon. She had a trunk full of secrets she didn't yet understand. Mark got into the front seat. He didn't look back at the house. He pulled the car away from the driveway. The gravel crunched under the tires. Eleanor watched the porch disappear. The house looked small. The for sale sign stood tall in the grass. The driveway was empty. She didn't cry. Eleanor Vance, 77 years old, had spent 40 years standing in front of chalkboards. She remembered the specific smell of the yellow chalk dust. It settled into the lines of her palms and stayed there. She remembered the way the light hit the library windows during her extra shifts on Saturday nights. For 20 years, she had worked those shifts after her regular school day ended. The library was quiet and cold. She didn't mind the silence. She minded the way her feet ached in her sensible shoes. Every dollar from those shifts went into a savings account with Mark's name on it. When Mark turned 24, He came to her with a plan for a software company. He had charts and graphs and a voice full of hunger. Eleanor didn't understand the software. She understood the look in her son's eyes. She took the velvet box from her nightstand that night. She sold the emerald ring Richard had given her for their 10th anniversary. The jeweler downtown had long, thin fingers and a magnifying glass. He told her the stone was rare. He gave her $3,000 in cash. Eleanor put the money in an envelope on the kitchen table next to a plate of homemade cookies. Mark had hugged her so hard she couldn't breathe. He had called her his silent partner. He had promised her she would never have to worry about money again. She believed him. 10 years later, the creditors began to call. The business was failing. Mark's voice on the phone was thin and brittle. Eleanor went to the travel agent on Main Street. She cancelled the retirement trip to the Mediterranean she had been planning for a decade. She had maps of Italy and Greece taped to her refrigerator. She took them down and folded them into the trash. She took the refund from the travel agent and went to the bank. She withdrew the entirety of her small retirement fund. She told the teller she didn't need to see the world. She told the teller that her son was her world. She signed the check over to a law firm in the city. She never told Richard how much of their life she had given away. She just told him she had changed her mind about traveling. Her daily life was a collection of these small, invisible economies. She bought the day-old bread from the bakery because it was half the price. She turned the heat down to 55 degrees every winter. She wore 2 pairs of thick wool socks and a heavy shawl Richard had bought her in 1972. Every night, she sat under the same brass lamp in the living room. She drank a single cup of Earl Grey tea with a small splash of milk. She graded her students' essays until the grandfather clock in the hall struck 11. She liked the scratch of the red pen on the paper. It made her feel like she was still part of the world. She trusted Mark because he was the only thing she had left of the life she loved. Richard had died of a heart attack in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. He had been gardening. The trowel was still in his hand when Eleanor found him. Mark had been the one to handle the funeral arrangements. He had held her hand while the dirt fell on the casket. He smelled of peppermint and expensive cologne. He told her he would always be there. He told her that the estate was too much for a woman of her age to handle alone. He told her that Sarah was an expert in financial planning. He told her they were a family. Eleanor believed him because a mother has to believe her son. She believed him even when the lawyers started coming to the house with papers to sign. The brass key on the navy velvet ribbon was her only secret. She had found it in Richard's jewelry box 2 weeks after the funeral. It was tucked under his cufflinks. A small note in his neat, architect's handwriting was wrapped around the ribbon. It said, "For when the winter comes." Eleanor didn't know what the key opened. She had tried it on every door in the house. She had tried it on the garden gate and the old shed in the back. It didn't fit anything. She started wearing it in her pocket. The metal felt cool against her leg. It was a weight she understood. She looked at the trunk in the car. It was made of dark, heavy oak. The corners were reinforced with iron. Richard had moved it into the attic himself. He had told her it was full of old blueprints from his early days as an engineer. He told her it was boring and heavy and not worth the effort of opening. "Leave it for the end," he had said with a small smile. "It's our insurance policy." Eleanor hadn't thought about the trunk for years. She had forgotten it until the movers found it in the back corner of the rafters. Now, sitting in the back of the black car, she felt the key in her pocket. The ribbon was soft from years of her thumb rubbing against it. Mark was talking to Sarah in the front seat. They were talking about the commissions from the sale. They were talking about a vacation in Aspen. They didn't talk to Eleanor. They didn't look in the rearview mirror. The car moved through the streets of the town where Eleanor had lived for 50 years. She watched the familiar trees pass by. She watched the park where she used to take Mark to play. The brass key felt heavier now. The winter had finally arrived. The lawyer's office was on the 42nd floor. The windows were floor-to-ceiling glass. Below them, the city looked like a toy set. The air in the room smelled of expensive leather and cold air conditioning. Mark sat in a chair made of chrome and black mesh. He didn't take off his coat. Sarah sat next to him. She was using a silver fountain pen to doodle on a napkin. It was the pen Richard had received for 30 years of service at the firm. Sarah had taken it from the hall table that morning. The attorney was a young man named Mr. Henderson. He had a very white shirt and a very thin tie. He didn't look at Eleanor. He looked at a stack of manila folders on his desk. "The closing on the Vance estate is scheduled for Friday," Mr. Henderson said. He tapped a pen against his teeth. The paperwork for the power of attorney is already in order. Eleanor sat in a wooden chair in the corner. It was the only chair without a cushion. What happens to the money from the sale? Eleanor asked. Her voice sounded small in the large room. Sarah didn't look up from her napkin. Mark leaned forward. He put on a face of deep concern. "We're worried about you, Mum," Mark said. "At your age, you can't manage these kinds of financial complexities alone." He reached across the desk and took a document from the lawyer. "The proceeds from the house will cover the debts. Sarah and I settled for you," Mark continued. "The business loans we took out in your name, the ones you signed for last year." Eleanor remembered signing papers in the kitchen. Mark had told her they were insurance forms. He had brought her a cup of tea and kissed her forehead. "This is what's best for everyone," Mark added. "But where will I live?" Eleanor asked. Sarah stopped doodling. She looked at Eleanor with a tight, efficient smile. "We found you a lovely spot, Eleanor," Sarah said. "It's private. It's quiet. It's exactly what you always said you wanted." She slid a single piece of paper across the polished mahogany desk. It was a map of the industrial canal district. There was a red circle around a pier 3 miles from the nearest grocery store. "The Grace," Mark said. "Dad's old canal boat. It's been sitting in that slip for 20 years. He stood up and straightened his jacket. "You're getting a property, Mom. It's more than most people have at 77. He spoke as if he were giving her a gift. "We're not being cruel. We're being practical." Then came the inventory of her life. The family, home to the developers, the savings account to the corporate creditors, the heirlooms to the estate auction house, the jewelry to the private collectors. While they exchanged victorious glances, already planning their trip to the mountains, Eleanor received what they called the remaining assets. It was a bus ticket and a rusted iron key for a boat that hadn't seen the open water since the 1990s. "You should have planned better, Mom," Mark said. He didn't look at her as he said it. "This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead." He was talking to the woman who had spent 40 years funding his every failure. He was talking to the woman who had sold her own rings to pay his bail. Sarah stood up and tucked the silver fountain pen into her designer handbag. "It's a clean break, Eleanor," she said. "The boat is yours. No taxes, no overhead, just peace and quiet." She walked toward the door without waiting for a reply. Mark followed her. He paused at the door. "The movers will drop your trunk at the pier," he said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The lawyer cleared his throat and looked at his watch. He had another meeting in 5 minutes. Eleanor stood up. Her knees made a dry, cracking sound. She picked up the bus ticket from the desk. She picked up the rusted iron key. She didn't ask them for help. She didn't tell them they were wrong. She felt the small brass key in her pocket. It was cold. It was the only thing they hadn't seen. The door to the office clicked shut. Eleanor stood in the center of the room. The silver-haired woman looked at the glass walls. She looked at the city that didn't know her name. She thought about the 40 years of teaching. She thought about the chalk dust. She thought about the red pens. She put the bus ticket in her purse. She walked toward the elevator. She didn't look back at the lawyer. She didn't look back at the empty mahogany desk. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. The ride down was silent. The city felt very far away. She was still here. Eleanor stood at the edge of the industrial canal district. The bus had left a cloud of grey exhaust that hung in the damp air. She held the handle of her single suitcase. The trunk sat on the pavement beside her. The movers had dropped it there and driven away without a word. They had not looked back at the woman in the thin wool coat. The sun was a pale disk behind the clouds. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Eleanor opened her purse. She counted the coins in the small zippered pocket. She had $12.42 left in the world. It was not enough for a hotel. It was not enough for a taxi back to the city center. It was just enough for a few days of bread and milk. The math was simple and cold. She reached into her pocket for her phone. The screen was cracked across the corner. She looked at the notification bar. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from Mark. There were no emails from Sarah. The last message was a generic alert from her bank. It told her that her primary account had been closed. The silence of the device felt heavier than the suitcase. She could have called the teachers' union. She could have looked for a women's shelter in the city. But she looked at the rusted iron key in her hand. Mark had called the boat a remaining asset. He had intended it as a final insult. He had wanted her to see how little she was worth. Eleanor looked down the long, cracked concrete path toward the water. The wind smelled of salt and old diesel fuel. She reached into her other pocket. Her fingers found the navy velvet ribbon. She pulled the brass key out and held it up to the light. It did not look like it belonged in this grey place. It was bright and polished. It felt warm from her skin. Richard had called it an insurance policy. He had never been a man who lied about the future. Eleanor began to pull her suitcase. The wheels made a rhythmic clicking sound on the pavement. She stopped every 10 feet to drag the heavy oak trunk. Her lower back felt like a hot wire was being pulled through it. Her breath came in short, ragged puffs. She did not call for help. There was no one to call. She kept her eyes on the masts of the boats in the distance. She moved toward the water. She moved toward the only thing she had left. The path was narrow and lined with weeds. The weeds were dead and brown from the salt spray. She didn't look back at the bus stop. She didn't look back at the life she had lost. The trunk bumped against the concrete. The brass key swayed on its ribbon. It was enough. Eleanor Vance, 77 years old, reached the end of the concrete path where the land finally surrendered to the water. The canal was a ribbon of dark green water that didn't seem to move. The wind caught the collar of her thin wool coat and pulled at her silver hair. Her knees felt like they were filled with crushed glass after the long walk. She stopped beside a stack of rusted lobster traps that smelled of old salt. She could not drag the heavy oak trunk another inch. She leaned against the wood and closed her eyes for a moment. The world felt very large and very cold. A small, scruffy dog sat on top of the traps. He was a terrier, with one white ear and a coat the color of wet sand. He didn't bark at the stranger. He just watched her with dark, intelligent eyes. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered to the dog. "I don't even have a biscuit for myself." The dog jumped down with a soft thud and trotted toward a narrow wooden pier. He stopped at the edge of the gangway and looked back at her. He gave a single, sharp yip. He waited as if he had an appointment to keep. Eleanor gripped the handle of her suitcase and began to move again. She used the last of her strength to heave the trunk onto the rotting planks of the pier. The wood groaned and shifted under the weight. The numbers on the slips were faded by decades of sun and salt. 22, 26, 30. Mark had said slip 32. He had laughed when he said it. He had known exactly what he was sending her to. A man stepped out from a small shack at the end of the pier. He wore a faded yellow rain slicker that had seen better years. His hip was stiff as he walked toward her with a measured pace. He stopped 5 feet away and squinted through the grey light. "You're Eleanor," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that hung in the air. Eleanor blinked against the stinging wind. "How do you know who I am?" she asked. The man leaned on a wooden cane made from a piece of driftwood. "Richard Vance talked about you every time he came down here to check the lines," he said. He said one day a woman with a brass key and a teacher's patience would show up. The man reached up and touched the brim of his wool cap. "I'm Arthur, the harbour master. I've been looking after this slip since '98. He pointed toward the very end of the dock where the shadows were deepest. "Your husband paid the maintenance fees 20 years in advance, Eleanor." He looked at the heavy trunk on the planks. "He said you'd need a place where no one could find you unless you wanted to be found." Eleanor looked where he pointed. The Grace did not look like a boat anymore. It looked like a ghost ship. The mahogany hull was grey and cracked like old bone. The windows were covered in layers of grime and salt. A thick vine of ivy had grown over the stern and tangled itself around the steering wheel. It was a ruin. It was a floating graveyard of the life she had once known. She felt a lump form in her throat that felt like a stone. This was the asset her son had given her. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a single beam of light hit the bow. There, carved deep into the wood in Richard's unmistakable hand, was a small ivy leaf. It was the exact same shape as the pendant she used to wear. It matched the pattern on the brass key tucked in her pocket. The carving hadn't rotted. The wood there was still solid and smooth. Eleanor felt her heart steady for the first time since the lawyer's office. She walked down the narrow gangplank toward the deck. The boat swayed gently under her weight. It felt like a heartbeat. She pulled the rusted iron key from her purse. The lock on the cabin door was orange with thick corrosion. She slid the key into the hole. It didn't turn at first. The metal felt fused together by time and neglect. Eleanor leaned her shoulder against the door and turned the key with both hands. She felt the mechanism resist. She felt it grind against the rust. Then, the bolt slid back with a heavy, metallic thud. The door swung open into the darkness. The air that rushed out smelled of cedar and old memories. The terrier trotted past her and disappeared into the cabin. Arthur the harbour master stayed on the pier. He didn't follow her in. "Welcome home, Eleanor," he said quietly. The door clicked shut behind her. Eleanor Vance, 77 years old, reached the end of the concrete path where the land finally surrendered to the water. The interior of the Grace was a cavern of damp shadows and forgotten smells. The ceiling was stained with dark circles where the rain had found its way through the old wood. The floorboards were slick, with a thin film of algae near the galley. Eleanor sat on the edge of a narrow wooden bunk. The mattress had been removed years ago by someone looking for scrap. She laid her thin wool coat over the bare wooden slats. She used her single suitcase as a pillow. Her fingers were swollen and stiff from the relentless cold of the canal. The knuckles were red and angry. She tried to make a fist, but her hand refused to close completely. The pain in her lower back was a constant, dull throb that never faded. It felt as if her spine were made of rusted iron rods. She moved slowly to avoid the sharp, electric stabs of agony in her knees. Every step across the cabin was a calculated risk. The first night was the hardest test of her life. The rain drummed on the roof like 1,000 small hammers. Every leak was a new problem that required a solution she didn't have. Eleanor found an old plastic bucket in a corner locker. She placed it under the steady drip near the cabin door. The sound of water hitting plastic was the only music in the room. She found a roll of heavy silver tape in a kitchen drawer. She used it to patch the largest cracks in the window glass. Her breath came out in small, white clouds that vanished into the dark. In the morning, Arthur the harbour master appeared at the gangway. He didn't ask how she had slept in the freezing damp. He didn't offer a dramatic apology for the state of the vessel. He simply held out a heavy metal thermos and a small bag of coal. "The stove still works if you know the trick to the flue," Arthur said. He showed her how to clear the old bird nests from the chimney. He showed her where the emergency hand pump was hidden under the floor. He didn't mention Mark or the house she had lost. He spoke to her as if she were a sailor, not a victim. Eleanor spent the next 3 days in a blur of painful motion. She used a piece of an old flannel shirt to scrub the grime from the galley sink. The water was freezing. Her knuckles turned a deep, bruised purple in the cold. The skin on her palms felt paper-thin and raw from the salt. Every time she bent down to reach a corner, her spine gave a sharp pop. She had to sit on the floor for 5 minutes to let the dizziness pass. She counted her breaths in the silence. 1, 2, 3. Her daily routine became a series of small, desperate battles. She woke at dawn when the light was still a bruised grey. She pumped the bilge water until her arms burned and her breath hitched. She walked to the small corner store 2 miles down the canal path. She bought a single loaf of bread and a small block of cheap cheese. She had $4.12 left in her purse now. The math of her survival was shrinking every hour. She had no way to pay for more coal when the bag ran out. On the 4th night, the storm turned violent and loud. The wind shrieked through the rigging of the larger ships at the pier. The Grace strained against its ancient, fraying lines. The boat pitched and rolled in the dark, churning water. Eleanor lay on the hard wooden slats of the bunk. The cold had settled into her bones and refused to leave. She thought about the central heating in the house Mark was selling. She thought about the thick duvet and the warm carpets. She reached for her phone on the small wooden shelf. The screen flickered and died twice before it finally stayed on. There was no signal in the industrial district. There were no missed calls from her son or her daughter-in-law. The inbox was empty of everything but corporate automated messages. She looked at the glowing screen until the light went out. The silence was a physical weight pressing against her chest. She thought, "I cannot fix a leaking boat. I am 77 years old and I am living on a floating ruin. The roof is failing and I have no money for wood. I have no money for coal to keep the fire going. I will run out of bread by Thursday morning. This is where I die. Not today, but this is how the story ends. This is what dying alone looks like." She sat up in the absolute darkness of the cabin. Her breath caught in her throat as the boat tipped sharply. The terrier, Barnaby, nudged her hand with his wet nose. His fur was damp and smelled of the canal and old wood. He didn't leave her side for a second. He rested his head on her knee and waited for her to move. A sudden gust of wind blew a piece of loose tarp against the window. It made a sharp, slapping sound against the glass. It sounded exactly like a hand hitting a wooden table. It sounded like the way she used to call her classroom to order. Eleanor felt a sudden, hot flash of anger in her chest. It wasn't for the storm or the leaks. It was for the man who thought she would just blow away. He thought she was a problem that would solve itself with time. "I am not a problem to be solved," she whispered to the dark. Her voice was cracked from the cold, but it was steady. "I am not an expense to be cut from a ledger." She stood up from the wooden bunk. She ignored the screaming protest in her hips and knees. She grabbed the silver tape and the plastic bucket. She went back to the leak near the cabin door. She worked until the sun began to grey the edges of the sky. She was still here. The rain stopped at 4 in the morning. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. Eleanor Vance sat on the floor of the cabin with her back against the damp wood. The terrier, Barnaby, lay across her feet. The first grey light of morning began to filter through the salt-crusted windows. It touched the dark oak of the trunk sitting in the center of the room. The trunk looked different in the light of the new day. It didn't look like junk or a burden anymore. It looked like a promise. Eleanor reached into her pocket. She felt the navy velvet ribbon. She pulled the brass key out and held it in her palm. Her hands were shaking. She didn't try to stop them. The skin on her knuckles was cracked and grey. She leaned forward and touched the iron lock of the trunk. "He told me not to open it," she whispered to the empty room. Barnaby lifted his head and watched her. "He said to wait until the winter came." Eleanor knelt on the hard floorboards. Her knees made a dry, grinding sound that echoed in the small space. She gripped the brass key with both hands. The keyhole was hidden behind a small, sliding plate of tarnished silver. She pushed the plate aside. The metal was cold. She slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. There was no resistance. There was no rust inside the mechanism. The key turned with a heavy, oiled click that felt solid in her bones. Eleanor stayed still for a long time. She didn't lift the lid. She listened to the water, lapping against the hull of the Grace. She listened to her own ragged breathing. Then, she placed her hands on the heavy oak lid. She pushed upward. The hinges didn't creak. They had been maintained with a precision that didn't match the exterior of the box. The smell of cedar and old paper filled the cabin. Inside, the trunk was lined with dark green silk. It was not filled with blueprints. It was not filled with dust. On top of everything sat a thick envelope made of heavy, cream-colored parchment. Eleanor's name was written on the front. The handwriting was Richard's. It was the neat, upright script of a man who built bridges to last a century. Eleanor picked up the envelope. Her breath hitched in her chest. She had to close her eyes for a moment to keep the room from spinning. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 documents clipped together with a silver fastener. The first was a deed. She read the words once. She didn't understand them. She read them again. The words began to settle into her mind, like stones falling into deep water. The house Mark had sold the family estate was not the only property. The land underneath the house was part of a maritime trust. Richard had purchased the land and the waterway rights in 1979. He had placed them in a trust that could only be dissolved by the primary trustee. The primary trustee was Eleanor. She turned to the second document. It was a record of corporate shares. Richard had been the silent owner of the firm that Mark had tried to build, but Richard hadn't given the shares to Mark. He had held them in the trust. The business loans Mark had forced Eleanor to sign were invalid. They were tied to assets Mark did not legally own. The signature on the power of attorney was worthless. It only covered personal property, not the holdings of the Vance Maritime Trust. The third document was a letter. Eleanor held it to her face. It still smelled faintly of the peppermint Richard used to keep in his pockets. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means our son has forgotten who he is. It means he has looked at you and seen a number instead of a mother. I knew his hunger would eventually turn into greed. I built this boat not just for the water, but to hold the truth. The house was always a shell. The trust is the foundation." Eleanor looked around the rusted cabin of the Grace. She looked at the peeling paint and the leaking roof. She realized now why Richard had paid the maintenance fees 20 years in advance. He hadn't been paying for a boat. He had been paying for a fortress. The boat wasn't an asset that Mark had discarded. It was the key to everything Mark thought he had stolen. The land, the business, the very ground Mark stood on belonged to the woman he had evicted. Eleanor began to laugh. It was a quiet, dry sound at first. Then it grew until it filled the small cabin. She sat on the floor and held the papers to her chest. Barnaby barked once and wagged his tail. The pain in her knees didn't matter. The cold in her bones didn't matter. She looked at the final line of Richard's letter. "The winter is here, Eleanor. Use the insurance policy. She stood up. She didn't move like an old woman. She moved like a woman who had just found her voice after 40 years of silence. She walked to the small table in the galley. She laid the documents out in the light of the rising sun. She read the figures one more time. The trust was valued at $7 million. The land rights were worth double that to the developers Mark was courting. Mark had given her the boat because he thought it was a cage. He didn't realize he had handed her the master key. She looked at her phone on the shelf. It was still dead. She didn't need it. She knew exactly who to call. She knew exactly what the next step would be. She looked at the brass key on the navy ribbon. It had done its job. She was no longer alone. Eleanor Vance did not wait for the trust attorneys to arrive from the city. She spent 4 of her remaining dollars on a gallon of white vinegar and a stiff bristle brush. She started with the galley. The grime of 20 years was a thick, greasy skin over the mahogany. She scrubbed until her shoulders burned and her breath came in short, hot gasps. The vinegar stung the raw cracks in her palms. She did not stop. By the second afternoon, the grey film began to lift. Underneath, the wood was a deep, wine-colored red. Arthur the harbour master watched her from the pier. He didn't offer to do the work for her. He knew better than to interfere with a woman reclaiming her life. Instead, he brought a gallon of marine-grade varnish that had been sitting in his shed. He brought a stack of sandpaper and a tin of brass polish. "The labels are gone," Arthur said as he set them on the gangway, "but the contents are still good." He limped back to his shack without waiting for a thank you. Eleanor worked through the daylight hours and into the dusk. She sanded the window frames until the silver splinters of old wood fell like snow. Her fingers were cramped into permanent hooks by the end of each day. She had to soak them in warm salt water just to straighten them enough to sleep. She found a roll of heavy green canvas in the engine room. She spent 3 nights sewing a new cover for the main hatch. She used a heavy needle and a pair of pliers to pull the thread through the stiff fabric. Her knuckles bled. She wiped the blood on a rag and kept sewing. The transformation moved from the inside out. She used a mixture of wood, ash, and oil to seal the leaks in the deck. She salvaged 2 mahogany planks from a broken crate behind the warehouse. She measured them twice and cut them with a hand saw she found in the hold. The saw was rusted, but she sharpened it with a flat stone from the canal bank. She replaced the rotted steps leading down into the cabin. The new wood was sturdy. It did not groan when she stepped on it. The property began to breathe again. The smell of mold and stagnant water was replaced by the scent of cedar and oil. Eleanor found a small brass plate hidden under layers of black paint on the steering column. She spent 4 hours rubbing it with the polish Arthur had provided. The black gave way to a dull brown, then a bright, honey-colored gold. The plate bore the name of the vessel and the year it was commissioned, the Grace, 1972. Below the name was the same small ivy leaf that Richard had carved into the bow. One morning, the sun broke through the heavy coastal fog. The light hit the water and reflected up onto the hull of the boat. For the first time in 2 decades, the Grace did not look like a wreck. The mahogany sides shone with a deep, liquid luster. The windows were clear and bright. The green canvas hatch cover was taut and professional. The boat sat higher in the water now that the bilge was dry. It looked like a jewel resting in the mud of the industrial district. Eleanor stood on the pier and looked at her hands. They were scarred and stained, with varnish and grease. The skin was tough. The tremors had stopped. She looked at her reflection in the cabin window. The 77-year-old woman looking back did not look tired. She looked like she was waiting for a breeze. She had built this sanctuary with her own blood and $10 of supplies. The millions in the trust were a weapon, but the boat was her victory. She took the brass key from her pocket. She had tied it to a new piece of sturdy twine. She hung it from a hook beside the restored steering wheel. It caught the light and cast a small golden star against the dark wood. The cabin was warm now. The small coal stove hummed with a steady heat. The terrier, Barnaby, sat on the new steps and watched the gulls. The property was no longer a remaining asset. It was a home. Eleanor Vance, 77 years old, woke up on the 10th morning and did not think about the family estate. She did not think about the mortgage or the property taxes her son had claimed were too high. She did not think about the mahogany table or the silver fountain pen Sarah had tucked into her designer bag. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin. She had painted it with 2 coats of white marine enamel. The reflection of the morning sun danced across the smooth surface in long, shimmering bands. She felt a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the air. It was a physical sensation of a knot untying itself after 40 years of tension. She stood up and walked to the galley. She didn't move with the hesitant shuffle of the woman who had left the lawyer's office. She moved with the balance of someone who knew the rhythm of the water beneath her feet. She boiled a pot of water on the small coal stove. She dropped a single tea bag into a chipped ceramic mug. She walked out onto the deck and sat on a wooden stool she had salvaged and repaired. The tea was hot against her palms. The steam rose in a straight line toward the blue sky. She looked at the steering wheel she had polished until it shone. "You were right, Richard," she said quietly to the salt air. "The house was just a box for the things we thought we needed." She ran her hand over the smooth wood of the railing. "This is the foundation." She didn't wait for an answer. The silence of the canal was enough. She felt a quiet strength in her spine that she hadn't felt since she was 30. She was no longer defining herself by the sacrifices she had made for a son who didn't want her. She was defining herself by the boat she had saved. Word of the grace began to spread through the industrial district. It didn't happen through social media or local news. It happened through the quiet talk of the people who worked the docks and the scrapyards. They saw the white-haired woman in the navy coat scrubbing the hull at dawn. They saw the way the light began to reflect off the polished brass of the portholes. They saw a ruin turning into a sanctuary. A young woman named Maya was the first to stop at the gate. She was barely 20. She wore grease-stained coveralls and carried a heavy wrench in her back pocket. She worked at the engine repair shop 3 blocks away. Maya stood on the pier for 5 minutes before she spoke. "My grandfather used to talk about this boat," Maya said. She looked at the mahogany sides with wide eyes. "He said it was the fastest thing on the canal in the 70s. Eleanor didn't offer her a tour. She offered her a seat on the deck. He was right," Eleanor said. "It was built for speed, but it was meant for staying." Maya sat on the edge of the hatch. She told Eleanor about the engines she was learning to fix. She told her about the way the men in the shop talked over her. Eleanor listened. She didn't offer advice. She offered a space where Maya's voice didn't have to compete with the noise of the world. By the end of the week, others began to arrive. A retired crane operator named Leo brought a basket of fresh apples. A woman named Clara, who ran the diner at the edge of the district, brought a warm loaf of sourdough bread. They didn't come to offer charity. They came because the sight of the grace made the industrial grey feel less permanent. They came to talk to the woman who had turned a discarded asset into a home. Eleanor made space for all of them. She set up 2 more stools on the deck. She shared the tea Leo brought and the bread from Clara. They sat together in the late afternoon sun. They talked about the history of the canal and the way the tides moved. There was no hierarchy on the deck of the boat. There was only the shared recognition of people who knew what it meant to build something from nothing. Eleanor was no longer a retired teacher or a widow or a problem. She was the captain of the Grace. One evening, Arthur the harbour master joined them. He sat in the corner with Barnaby, resting his head on his stiff leg. He watched Eleanor as she explained the mechanism of the brass key to Maya. "They're coming, Eleanor," Arthur said quietly when the others had left. "The developers. And your boy." He looked at the clear windows and the gleaming wood. They heard about the boat. They heard it's worth more than the scrap value now. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't look at her phone. She looked at the dark water of the canal. "Let them come, Arthur," she said. "The lock is already turned." She felt the solid weight of the documents in the trunk below deck. She felt the peace of a woman who finally knew her own worth. She was no longer afraid of the winter. She was still here. The black SUV stopped at the end of the gravel path. Mark stepped out and adjusted his silk tie. Sarah followed him, stepping onto the dirt in 4-inch heels. She looked at the rusted fences and the grey water of the canal. "This is disgusting, Mark," Sarah said. She pulled her designer handbag closer to her side. Mark didn't answer her. He was looking at the Grace. The boat sat high in the water. The mahogany sides glowed in the afternoon sun. The brass portholes caught the light like gold coins. Eleanor stood on the deck. She was wearing her navy wool coat and thick work gloves. She was holding a coil of rope. Barnaby sat at her feet, his ears pricked forward. Mark walked to the edge of the pier. He put on a face of deep, painful concern. "Mum, thank God," he said. He reached out a hand as if he were going to step onto the gangway. "We've been so worried about you." Eleanor stayed exactly where she was. She did not move toward the railing. She did not offer him her hand. "We've been sick with the thought of you out here alone," Mark continued. In the damp and the cold, at your age, it's just not safe. He looked at Sarah, who nodded quickly. We're just being realistic, Eleanor, Sarah said. A boat is a liability. What if there's a fire? What if you fall? Mark leaned in closer. His voice was a low, soothing hum. The developers made an offer on the entire canal district this morning, Mark said. They want this specific slip for a new luxury dock. It's worth a fortune. He smiled, but the muscles around his eyes remained tight. We're not being cruel. We're being practical. This is what's best for everyone. Eleanor looked at her son. She saw the way his eyes darted to the polished brass. She saw the way he avoided looking at her face. You didn't come because you were worried, Mark, Eleanor said. Her voice was clear and steady. You came because the surveyor told you the maritime rights for this slip are not in the estate's name. Mark's smile vanished. Mom, don't be difficult. You don't understand the legal complexities. I understand them perfectly, Eleanor said. I opened the trunk, Mark. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a gull crying overhead. Mark's face went very still. Dad was an engineer, Eleanor said. He knew how to build things that would last, and he knew how to protect them. She walked to the edge of the deck and looked down at him. The power of attorney you used to sell the house only applied to the surface assets. It never touched the Vance Maritime Trust. Sarah stepped forward, her face turning a bright, angry red. That's impossible. We checked everything. You checked what you could see, Eleanor said. You didn't check what was buried under the floor of an old boat. She felt the small brass key in her pocket. It felt like a heavy weight that was finally in the right place. The trust owns the land beneath the house, Eleanor continued. It owns 40% of your firm's original shares, and it owns this slip. She looked at Mark's expensive suit. The developers can't buy the canal district without my signature, and you can't sell the house without paying the trust back for every dollar of the land value. Mark stepped onto the gangway. The wood groaned under his weight. Mom, we're a family. We can work this out. Think of your grandchildren. I am thinking of them, Eleanor said. I'm thinking of the example you've set for them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point her finger. She simply stood her ground on the mahogany deck. She had scrubbed with her own blood. You gave me this boat because you thought it was worthless, Eleanor said. Because you thought I was worthless. She looked at the steering wheel, then back at her son. You were wrong about both. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm. Let's go, Mark. We'll have the lawyers look at this. She's just a confused old woman. I'm not confused, Sarah, Eleanor said. I'm the trustee. And as the trustee, I'm asking you to leave my property. Mark looked at the boat one last time. He looked at the ivy leaf carved into the bow. He looked at the woman who had funded his life for 40 years. He didn't see a mother. He saw a wall he couldn't climb. You're going to regret this, Mom, he whispered. I already do, Eleanor said. I regret believing you for as long as I did. She turned her back on them. She picked up the coil of rope and began to secure the line. She didn't listen to Sarah's heels clicking back toward the car. She didn't listen to the roar of the SUV engine as it reversed down the path. The black car disappeared behind the rusted gates. Eleanor sat on the wooden stool. Barnaby put his head on her knee. The wind smelled of salt and the particular sweetness of the coming evening. She was 77 years old. She was sitting on a boat that no one could take from her. He was wrong about both. 6 months after the afternoon, the black SUV drove away. The canal district looked different. The grey winter ice had melted into a bright, clear blue. The weeds along the path were replaced by small, stubborn patches of yellow wildflowers. Eleanor Vance, 77 years old, sat on the deck of the Grace. She was wearing a new wool sweater the color of the deep sea. Maya was in the engine room below. The rhythmic clinking of a wrench against metal echoed up through the open hatch. The fuel line is clear. Eleanor, Maya called out. Her voice was full of a pride she hadn't possessed 6 months ago. Eleanor was no longer holding a red pen to grade papers. She was holding a navigation chart of the coastal waters. Arthur sat in his usual corner of the deck. Barnaby lay across his feet, snoring softly in the sun. The boat didn't just sit in the water now. It strained against the new nylon lines. The mahogany sides were polished to a mirror finish. The brass portholes caught the light and threw golden circles across the pier. The legal battle in the city had ended without a single shout. The trust attorneys had moved with the quiet precision of a surgical team. The family estate was no longer a for sale sign on a dead lawn. It had been signed over to the local university as a public conservatory. Mark and Sarah had moved to a smaller apartment 3 states away. Eleanor hadn't seen them since the day on the pier. She didn't check her phone for their names anymore. She didn't wait for a message that would never come. She reached into the pocket of her navy coat. Her fingers found the brass key on the navy velvet ribbon. She pulled it out and held it up to the light. The metal was warm from the spring sun. She didn't need it to unlock the trunk anymore. The oak box sat in the cabin, its green silk lining holding Eleanor's new journals. The journals were filled with sketches of the coast and notes on the tide. She looked at the small ivy leaf carved into the bow of the boat. It matched the shape of the key in her hand perfectly. She looked out toward the horizon. The canal met the open sea 2 miles to the east. The water there was a deep, restless indigo. She felt the engine of the Grace rumble to life beneath her feet. The vibration was a steady, living pulse. Eleanor looked at the empty space beside her on the bench. She whispered a single sentence to the man who had seen the winter coming. "We made it to the water, Richard." She put the key back in her pocket. She took the wheel and felt the weight of the vessel respond to her touch. She didn't look back at the industrial gate. She didn't look back at the empty concrete path. The water was calm. Eleanor Vance lived 77 years before she learned that her life belonged only to her. She had spent decades giving her time and her money to build a future for a man who did not value her history. She had been a teacher, a mother, and a widow. But on the deck of the Grace, she became a captain. The world looks at a woman with silver hair and sees an ending. They see a story that has already been written. They see a person who should be grateful for a small room and a quiet corner. But Eleanor showed us that the most powerful stories are often hidden in the places people discard. She found her strength in a rusted lock. She found her future in an abandoned canal boat. She proved that greed is a loud and shallow thing, but loyalty and love are deep and silent like the sea. Richard Vance knew the character of the woman he married. He knew that the winter would come for her eventually. He didn't give her a mansion to defend. He gave her a vessel to sail. He gave her the tools to reclaim her own dignity. Justice was not a gavel hitting a wooden desk. Justice was the sound of an engine turning over in the morning fog. It was the sight of a woman standing tall against the wind on a mahogany deck. Eleanor's hands are still work-worn. Her knees still ache. But she is not a problem to be solved. She is a woman who has found her own shore. The air on the canal no longer smells like diesel and rust to her. It smells like the cedar oil she uses on the cabin walls. It smells like the fresh tea Maya brings every morning at sunrise. The community around the docks has grown. They don't see a confused old woman when they look at Eleanor. They see a landmark. They see a reason to keep working. Leo, the crane operator, still brings the apples. Clara still brings the bread. They sit together and watch the water move. They are a family built of shared labor and mutual respect. This is the legacy Richard Vance truly left behind. He didn't just leave a trust fund or a piece of land. He left a space where a woman could prove her own value. The house in the city is a conservatory now. Students walk through the rooms where Eleanor once graded papers. They don't know the name of the woman who funded the floors they walk on. But Eleanor doesn't mind the silence of her name in that house. She prefers the sound of the water hitting the hull. She prefers the weight of the brass key. She is exactly where she was meant to be. The camera pulls back as the sun sets over the water. It shows the small, bright boat moving steadily toward the open sea. It shows the silver hair of the woman at the wheel. It shows a life that is just beginning at 77. If Eleanor's journey through the storm moved you today, if you have ever felt the weight of a family's betrayal or the cold of an empty room, you are not alone. Leave the word trust in the comments to show that you believe in the power of a hidden strength, because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. Justice doesn't always have a voice, but it always has a way. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their worth is not determined by the people who let them go, because together we prove that dreams don't age.